The scriptures are brimming with epic narratives depicting God's providential intervention in human history through ordinary people who possess both noble characteristics and vulnerabilities. Throughout Heroes with Feet of Clay, now over 12 months in the making, we have summoned you into the stories of the men and women of the Bible's Old Testament to learn from the moral and ethical choices they faced, which transcend their time and culture and can be applied to our lives today. We met several of the patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph. We have journeyed with Moses through the Exodus from Egypt and the wandering of the Israelites in the wilderness. We have peered into the ranks as Joshua led Israel to conquer the Promised Land. And in the previous episode, we were introduced to Samuel, a man dedicated to God from childhood who grew up to be a powerful prophet with impeccable integrity. The next several episodes feature the story of Israel's greatest king, whose life was filled with action and adventure, deep friendships, and forbidden love. His is a story of an unlikely shepherd boy from an insignificant village who rose to power and dethroned a king. Join us as we meet the man after God's own heart, King David. The world needs leaders. Under strong leadership, the people thrive in peace and prosperity. God is the true, benevolent King of Kings, the one who ushers in peace and guides and protects his people. And God has chosen to delegate leadership to earthly men and women who act as his ambassadors and who deliver his people from their enemies. The story of David is found in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. His narrative begins with another king in power, which raises an interesting question. Why did the people need a king? If God was to be the king of Israel, how did they end up with an earthly king? God had always provided strong leaders like Moses and Joshua. However, following Joshua's death, Israel's 12 tribes were left without a head to guide them. Without a leader in place, the people lost their way, and the peace and prosperity that was ushered in under their strong leaders came crashing to the ground when they were plundered by rival peoples. During that time, God raised up judges to remind the people that the Lord's ways are better than our own, and God's Spirit empowered the judges to help Israel overcome their enemies, and under their leadership, they restored peace to Israel. However, when those judges died, the people cycled back to wandering and doing what was right in their own eyes, and they were once again at war with their neighbors. After many seasons of this cycle, and fed up with the consequences, the Israelites longed for a more permanent head of state who would guarantee succession such that their leadership would be secure. The elders of Israel gathered and decided to approach Samuel, who served as prophet and judge for the people, and they demanded a king. They said, "We want a king over us. Then we will be like the nations, with a king to lead us and to go before us and fight our battles." Infuriated, because he rightly knew that God was to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords for the people, Samuel inquired of God, and the Lord replied, "Listen to the people. It's not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king." Samuel obeyed God and honored the people's request. And God directed Samuel's steps and orchestrated a meeting between Samuel and Saul, a man from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul's physique even commanded authority, as he was a head taller than anyone else, and he was handsome. The Lord revealed to Samuel that Saul would deliver the people from their enemies, the Philistines. And so, using the symbol of the times, a horn of anointing oil, Samuel anointed Saul, inaugurating him as the first king of Israel, and he was filled with God's Spirit. Samuel, now advanced in years, gave one final farewell speech. Motioning towards Saul, he declared, "Here is your king. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you, as it was against your ancestors." For a while, Saul seemed to be a strong and faithful king. Like the prophets and judges, he heard from the Lord and obeyed. He led the people to victories over their enemies. However, not too long afterward, despite discerning the way of the Lord, he failed to listen to the word of the Lord. Saul recognized he'd made a mistake, so he began to sacrifice burnt offerings to the Lord, but still, as Samuel had forewarned during his farewell speech, God rejected him as king. God sent Samuel to bear his message to Saul. Samuel spoke to Saul, saying, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." The Lord was seeking a king who would be a man after God's own heart, so that the people would be able to dwell in the security of God's powerful love. But Saul was no longer that man. After delivering the bad news, Samuel turned to leave, but Saul reached out and grasped the hem of his robe, and it tore immediately. Samuel interpreted what had happened as a symbol from the Lord, an omen regarding Saul's leadership. Samuel said, "Like the tear in my robe, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and he has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you." This would set in motion Saul's insecurity, an insecurity which would only grow when the neighbor to whom Samuel referred was found. For a time, Samuel was distraught, grieved over Saul's failure and Israel's need for a leader who would pursue the Lord. But God pierced through his grief and spoke to him again, saying, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." Samuel was a bit wary. To anoint another king while a king was in power would be a treasonous crime, punishable by death. So Samuel went to the house of Jesse under the guise of sacrificing to the Lord. When he arrived at Jesse's home, Samuel's eyes were drawn to Eliab, Jesse's oldest son. Like Saul, Eliab was tall and strong. Everything about his outward appearance screamed that he was king-worthy. However, God spoke to Samuel and invited him to look deeper. "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. With Eliab rejected, the other brothers were presented. One by one, Jesse paraded 7 of his sons in front of Samuel, but one by one, the Lord rejected them. Finally, Samuel, who must have been wondering if he had gone to the wrong Jesse's house, inquired of Jesse, "Do you have any other sons?" And Jesse confessed that his youngest boy was still out in the fields tending to his sheep. Samuel insisted that he be called and refused to eat until his eyes glimpsed the boy. When he was brought to him, and when Samuel laid eyes on David, he saw in him the future king of the nation of Israel. Samuel anointed him with oil, and the Spirit of the Lord that once filled Saul fell on David. With the knowledge that God had rejected him as king, that God's Spirit had been removed, Saul was tormented by an evil spirit. If you've ever experienced feelings of sorrow, you may have found that music can be a healing balm to the soul. Noticing the king's depression, his attendants suggested bringing in a skillful musician who could soothe Saul's soul. Providentially, one of the attendants just happened to know that one of Jesse's sons was a prolific musician whose instrument was the lyre. What's more, he was a handsome young man and a skillful warrior, a twofold description that enfleshes the twin aspects of David's character and outlines the next 2 chapters of 1 Samuel. Saul brought David into his inner court, and David played music for the king, which brought relief. Thus, David became the instrument through which God would bring healing and peace to Saul and eventually to the kingdom of Israel. However, little did Saul know, he had invited into his own inner court the person whom God had chosen to inherit his throne. Meanwhile, the Philistines, Israel's greatest rival at the time, mobilized their military forces for war on the border between the two nations. In response, King Saul assembled his armies and camped opposite the valley of Elah in the hill country of Judah. With the Philistines on one hill, clanking their spears and shields, and the Israelites on the other, the tensions grew. From the enemy encampment emerged a colossal gladiator whose size and stature alone were intimidating. Standing 9 feet, 9 inches tall, wearing 125 pounds of glistening state-of-the-art bronze armor, and wielding a spear with 15-pound tip on the end, Goliath lumbered down into the valley each day for 40 days to taunt the Israelites. He pridefully boasted, "I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." The whole Israelite army was paralyzed with fear. No one was eager to step up to Goliath, the man of Goth's challenge. Jesse's 3 oldest boys were among those who had followed Saul out to the front lines. Concerned for his boys, Jesse summoned David from the fields where he was shepherding and sent him with a care package of roasted grain and bread and cheese to provide to the troops. In truth, what Jesse really wanted was to get word from his sons about how the war was going. David loaded up and departed early the next morning and arrived at the front lines just as the battle cries split the air. David quickly dropped his gear with the quartermaster and bolted to the battle lines to check on his brothers, only to be assaulted by the caustic rhetoric of Goliath. While all of Israel sat and listened day in and day out without response, David incisively distilled the heart of Goliath's insult. Who is this? Who is this Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God? While everyone was focused on Goliath's size and armor and weaponry, David was focused on the seething reproach spoken against God. David said, "Who does this guy think he is anyway?" His brothers chastised him, but David said he would fight Goliath. Word made it back to King Saul that David was speaking against Goliath, so he summoned him back to his tent. David, who likely became comfortable in the king's presence, having played his lyre for him, speaks first to the king. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." To all who heard this, it must have seemed laughable. Goliath was a brute, and he was asking for a man to fight. David was a mere boy. Saul points out the obvious to David, but David replied that as a shepherd, he had fought off lions and bears with God's help, and with the help of the Lord, he would take down this man as well. Saul sent him off with God's help and dressed him in his own armor. Remember, Saul was a whole head taller than most Israelites, so the armor was likely far too large for young David, who looked more like a child dressed in his father's clothes than a warrior adorned for battle. Uncomfortable in the unfamiliar garb, David shed Saul's armor and picked up his shepherd's tools. He grabbed his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones and called out to Goliath. The thunderous laughter of Goliath must have shaken the whole valley when his eyes met David's. Goliath taunted David just as he had the Israelite army. Yet David calmly and confidently asserted, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled." Goliath thought David didn't have a prayer, but David trusted that God would guide the stone. Goliath telegraphed advancement, and David dashed forward to meet him. Reaching into his pouch, he slung a stone, which struck Goliath on the forehead. It was a bullseye. Goliath fell face down, and David had his head. With all the buildup of the text, the battle was over almost before it began. The Israelites immediately rallied. Emboldened by the great upset, they charged and chased the Philistines all the way back to their villages. King Saul turned to Abner, the commander of his army, and inquired, "Who is this guy?" And they summoned David, who still had Goliath's head in his hand. Saul asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" Now, some have speculated that Saul, fearful of this man upon whom God's Spirit so powerfully dwelled, hoped that David would reply that he was Saul's son, thereby pledging his allegiance to him. However, David deftly dodged and replied, "I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem." This was both accurate and acceptable, but not entirely what Saul wanted to hear. The tension of this moment was palpable. It would only grow as David's fame spread. Saul was already insecure because Samuel had confirmed that the Lord had rejected him as king. He knew that God's Spirit had departed from him. Now, he would only grow more and more suspicious of David, whom the people adored. Saul rightly feared for his future as king of Israel. The immense 18-foot, 24,000-pound marble stone lay on its side in a courtyard behind the Florence Cathedral for decades. Nicknamed by the custodian of the church and passers-by, the Giant, it would lie dormant for nearly half a century until 1501, when a 26-year-old artist named Michelangelo was commissioned to reveal from its rough form the statue of David. Traditionally, artists depicted David following his victory, standing triumphantly over Goliath's slain body. However, Michelangelo elected to portray him immediately before the fight, his face concerned but confident. He stands contrapposto, with his weight on one leg conveying motion while he looks like a boy. David stands 17 feet tall, much taller than the biblical giant he faced. These details convey the strength by which he stands, and the strength of the Lord and heaven's armies. In his defeat of Goliath, the boy David emerges as a man of bold and unwavering faith, which undoubtedly captured the imagination of Israel, as it has our own thousands of years later. In the Old Testament, songs would be sung of David's victories, songs which would ring in Saul's ears. And outside of the Old Testament, they're found as well. The writer Sirach, in an apocryphal book, sings David's praises, saying, "In his youth, did he not kill a giant and take away the people's disgrace? When he whirled the stone in the sling and struck down the boasting Goliath? For he called on the Lord the Most High, and he gave strength to his right arm to strike down a mighty warrior and to exalt the power of his people." This is the beginning of the ascent of a shepherd boy who will become king. Let's look at some of the principles which transcend David's story to penetrate our own lives. First, David's story portrays God's longing for humanity to seek his heart. God seeks leaders who will seek him above their own desires or the desires of others. While Saul initially sought the Lord, he quickly lost his way. In the heat of battle with the Philistines, rather than seek the Lord prior to making his decisions, he simply tried to offer burnt offerings after the fact, sort of like it's easier to ask forgiveness rather than permission. After another battle with the Amalekites, his men took plunder from the Philistines, even though God had strictly forbidden it. Saul was afraid to challenge them, caring more about what humanity thought than what God thought. In both cases, he demonstrated he was not a man after God's own heart, which is why God chose David, who would be a man after God's own heart. Secondly, God is not interested in appearances. God looks far deeper inside of a person. God is not interested in those who have the appearance of righteousness but lack the genuine heart's transformation. God is interested in changing someone from the inside out. Therefore, God does not judge a person by their external qualities. He's not interested in how good looking we are. He's not interested in how qualified we appear or what strengths we possess. God is interested in the one who will offer their whole heart and life to seeking God's glory. Then, God can use even a boy to accomplish what seems impossible. The story of David and Goliath is not merely a story about the underdog winning. It's a story about the power of God over and against all other powers. God can bring help from the humblest of places, a young shepherd boy from Bethlehem to defeat the mightiest warrior of the Philistines. Ultimately, God will bring about a good shepherd from Bethlehem who will take down the greatest bully, death itself. And the final principle we can glean from the story of David is that The people of God should not rely on the tools of the world, but completely lean on God's strength. The high-tech weaponry of the time was bronze, from which Goliath's armor and weapons were cast. David relied not on advanced tech, but on God's power, and David prevailed. At times, the church relies on the latest trends, presuming that these will make us successful. Or worse, at times, the church succumbs to fighting with the weapons of the world. But the New Testament is clear. Our weapons are not of this world, but we put on the armor of God, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, feet fitted with the gospel of peace, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. We must never be tempted to use any of the world's weapons when we fight a spiritual battle. So, are you a person after God's own heart? Have you dropped the weapons of the world and are you equipped with the armor of God? Then there is no telling what God might do in your life. These are just a few of the principles of the heir apparent, King David, and I encourage you to read his story from 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 17. In the next episode, we will continue to see the heir to the throne's meteoric rise from shepherd boy to king. Until next time, God bless.
Images for Heroes with Feet of Clay are provided by Kingstone Comics.
The best-selling book of all time. Now, the most complete graphic adaptation of all time. Action, adventure, romance, doctrine, history, the future. The Kingstone Bible. Own it today.
The Kingstone Bible and Kingstone Comics, available at the First Church Book Center or online at kingstone.co.